Welcome to this presentation. Here we will be looking at a comparison between Egyptian history and the events in the Bible, and in particular we're looking at the Exodus and events surrounding that. Now, apologies for the length of this presentation, but the details are important, and to get a good picture we need to look at all of the information that's available. Now, the title, Finding the Missing Exodus, is a little bit strange maybe. Is the Exodus missing? The question really is, did it happen? So in this presentation we'll be looking at why there are questions about the Exodus, and does it matter? Our Bible chronology is wrong. And please don't be frightened off by the fact that I'm using chronologies or using that term. I think you'll find it interesting even if you're utterly bored by chronologies and numbers and all that kind of thing. And for the most part of this presentation we'll be looking at comparison between events such as Israel and Egypt and the Exodus and the fall of Jericho, and how that fits in with known history. But before all that, there is the big question: was there an Exodus as described in the Bible? And many people, many expert people, believe that there was no Exodus as described. And Israel Finkelstein, chairman of the archaeological department at Tel Aviv University, with archaeology historian Neil Asher Silberman, published a book called The Bible Unearthed: Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origin of its Sacred Text. And in that book they state the Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert, did not conquer the land of Canaan in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. So in particular they're saying the Exodus never happened. And this is not just one person's point of view, not just some random individual. This is an expert in the field, an expert in the field of archaeology, and he's looked at all the archaeological evidence. He's come to the conclusion there was no Exodus. And this is the view of most archaeologists. If we quote from Wikipedia here, it says the consensus of modern scholars is that the Torah does not give an accurate account of the origins of the Israelites, who appear instead to have formed as an entity in the central islands of Canaan in the late 2nd millennium BC from the indigenous Canaanite culture. Most modern scholars believe that the story of the Exodus has some historical basis but contains little material that is provable. So that's a concession from them that there might be some historical basis. So obviously there are huge doubts about this. And they're not saying that because they've got some kind of axe to grind. They're not saying it because they want to be clever or write a book or anything like that. They're saying that because that's what an objective view of the archaeology says. And what are the reasons for this? Well, one of the points is the city of Jericho was unoccupied for many years before and afterwards. So how can Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho if there was no Jericho, or if it was just a heap of ruins? What was he doing there? And there's no evidence for Israelites being in Egypt. Perhaps that's not too strange, because if the Israelites had been in Israel, in Egypt for hundreds of years, all their pottery, all their everything would have been very much like the Egyptians. So maybe that's not quite so significant, but it is notable. there's no evidence for Israelites wandering in the wilderness. I don't know how you'd find evidence for Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Some people believe there should be evidence. And one of the key points was that Egypt was prosperous, and at the time that we think the Exodus took place, there was no sign of calamities as described in the 10 plagues that struck the land. And obviously some people say, well, maybe they sanitized their history, maybe they changed things around and didn't want to admit what had happened. And people often do rewrite the history books. There is such a thing as revisionist history, and that's been around for many millennia. But even if they wrote their own histories, there are nations round about them, and nations that envied their lands and would have been quite happy to conquer their lands and take their territory. And there's no mention in any of these foreign lands either of their conquests or of the things that happened to Egypt. On the contrary, Egypt was the one that was going out with its armies, conquering other lands. The pharaohs built lavish monuments and tombs for themselves, and their mummies are in museums, and their mummies have been examined by experts, and as far as we can tell, none of them have drowned in the Red Sea, although if they were in the Red Sea, you wouldn't have their mummy at all, would you? They would have vanished. So there are obviously things that are not quite right. We do have to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is a reason for concern. Why does this matter? Well, the Exodus was a major event, one that led to the founding of the Israelites as a people, and to the establishment of the Old Testament law, because the law was given on Mount Sinai after they came out of the land of Egypt. And there was the wandering in the wilderness, and there was this 40-year period, and the first 5 books of a Bible are covered by this. So the reliability of the scriptures come into question, and were these first 5 books really inspired by God if they talk about something that never happened? And the whole basis of a Jewish and Christian faiths starts to unravel. You pull out one thread, and all the rest starts to fall apart. You have to ask the question, was the person who wrote the commandment not to be a false witness also not telling the truth, because he was the one who talked about the Exodus, if it was an individual writing the book of Exodus? And it gets worse than that. There are many references to these events in the book of Kings, and in Chronicles, and in Psalms, and in Jeremiah, Isaiah, Nehemiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, and probably more besides these. All these references to the Exodus and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt and being led out of Egypt. And if this is all false, if this is all a fiction, how can these books be said to be inspired by God? Are they divinely inspired if they mention this lie, if indeed it is a lie? And it's not just the Old Testament, but no Exodus means there was no Passover. There was nothing to pass over. There was no reason for the angel of death to pass over the firstborn in the families. So there's no Passover. The New Testament references would be an error. And of course Jesus Christ partaking of the Passover before his crucifixion, and he's saying he desired to take part in this. Was he partaking in a lie if the Exodus never happened? So we see here that no Exodus means no Passover, means a whole collapse of Scripture that seems to fall away. And can you really believe any of it? Is it reliable? Is it, at the very least, you'd have to say, is it actually divinely inspired? If if it's referring to this thing that never happened, did Jesus Christ, the Son of God, not know that what he was celebrating was a fiction? That's if there was no Exodus. That's why we say, does it matter? Now, you can't actually determine whether or not there was an Exodus without first knowing approximately when it took place. And this is where we get into the slightly murky thing, and many people have looked into this in quite a lot of detail, and they've done all their fancy graphics, and you won't see any fancy graphics here, sorry. First thing to mention, ancient history is not a precise science. Every bit of information comes with a caveat. There is a this, there is a maybe, and there's a possibly, and there's a likely, and there's a under these assumptions. But we do need to take things at face value as far as possible. On top of our Bible chronology, working out the timeline does have some ambiguities, and those few individuals that are actually interested in Bible chronology also have a tendency to be quite invested in their own timelines, and that's a polite way of saying they're very fixated on their own point of view, and they don't tend to listen to other people's points of view very readily. And they all seem to say slightly different things for the numbers in the Bible and when the events took place. Now, you can identify where the difficult areas are for building a timeline from the Bible. Now, there is a period, the Neo-Babylonian period, where dates are known quite precisely. When King Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon, and when King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, was taken captive to Babylon in 597 BC. These are dates that are fairly well established. Also, there's the fall of Samaria to the Assyrians in 721 BC. That also gives a fairly reliable date, and that date, the fall of Samaria, is quite consistent with what we know about the Babylonian period and the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. So we're fairly happy that it's at this much later stage in history that things are okay. We can get the times to maybe within a year or so. Now, if we start to work our way backwards through time, first of all, we look at the times of the kings of Israel and Judah. Now, if you take the Bible literally, you get one particular calendar, but the Assyrians also mention some of the events that we see in the Bible, and there are at least 4 events that you can tie to things that are noted by the Assyrians. And the timing doesn't quite line up. The events themselves are consistent, but the timings don't quite adjust. So what do? Do you take the Bible literally, or do you adjust things to try and fit the Assyrian calendar? Here we'll be taking the Bible at face value, and the question of a problem with the Assyrian calendar, I have some clues as to where that might be going wrong, but that's speculation and we won't cover that here. Now, the second uncertain time period is the time period from Solomon building the temple in Jerusalem through to the Exodus itself. That time period, many people believe they know what that is, and here we'll be taking another look at that in more detail. And the third time period is an even earlier time period, which is how long were the Israelites in Egypt? Was it 430, 400, or 215 years? Now, most people, when they look at this, they carefully, if you look at it superficially, you come to around 400, but when you look at it more carefully, you find it's about 215 years, and the 430 actually applies to the time period from both Canaan and Egypt. And there's a reference to 430 years. I think it's in Galatians, from the time the covenant was given to Abraham through until the Exodus or Mount Sinai. So here we have these 3 times that we need to look at a little bit. The kings of Israel and Judah are probably the easiest. We won't go through the details, but you can line up the year of one king with the year of another king, because you've got 2 kingdoms, each with their own years. So you could say the first year of this king is the 18th year of that king, and the third year of that king is the first year of such and such a king. We obviously don't need to go through that in intricate and painful detail, maybe, if you're not interested in such things, but you can work your way through the whole time when there was the divided kingdom and all these kings. And people have done this, obviously. People have been doing this for hundreds of years, looking at these things and comparing the kings, and they eventually get to something like what we see on the chart here, the reigns of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, based on a literal or face value interpretation of what it says in the Bible. So now we have a time period that we've built up from a time that we do know, the fall of Samaria, through until Rehoboam, king of Judah, son of Solomon. And we know Solomon reigned for 40 years, and David 40 years before him, and Saul 40 years before him. So we're sort of building up our timeline that way. A few examples of calculated dates, in case anyone's actually interested in numbers. We get the division of the kingdom, according to the taking Bible at face value. We get a date for the division of the kingdom in 976 BC. Now, one of the classic attempts at reconciling the differences between the Assyrian and Bible numbers was done by the work of Edwin Thiel in his book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. His work has been widely criticized for, among other things, introducing innumerable co-regencies, so saying this king was reigning the same king time as his son or his father, constructing a complex system of calendars and using unique patterns of calculation. But many other people are very impressed by his work. But the thing to note is there is that discrepancy, unknown reasons. So here we get and the difference is about 40 years, so it's not huge, but it is significant. So here we say the founding of Solomon's temple was started in 1013 BC, and according to Thiel it was 967 BC. Not a huge difference, but a difference. So now that we know when the Solomon's temple was started to be built, we can use a particular verse in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 that helps us determine the date of the Exodus, hopefully. And it says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over the land of Israel, in the month Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So we know what the 4th year of Solomon's reign is, and this is 480 years after the children came out of the land of Egypt. So you can say, well, now we know exactly when the Exodus took place. So the time from the Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple, 480 years according to 1 Kings 6:1, which gives us a date for the Exodus of 1493 BC, or slightly earlier, or slightly later I should say, 1447 BC, if you take the work of Thiel. So now we've got a date for the Exodus. But there's a fly in the ointment. The new kingdom of Egypt shows no signs of the 10 devastating plagues. Now when I say the new kingdom, there were times when Egypt was very prosperous and doing well. There was the old kingdom when they built the Great Pyramid and other pyramids. There was the Middle Kingdom, which was a shorter period, and there was the New Kingdom when things were going well. In between, they call them the intermediate period, but it was a very rough time for Egypt and very disrupted time. But this is a new kingdom now, when we've got happy pharaohs and things going according to plan. We've also got the date for the fall of Jericho, 1493 minus 40 years comes to 1453 BC, or 1407 according to the Assyrian calendar adjustments. And at this time, Jericho has been unoccupied for 100 years at that time. So we've got a major conflict here. From what we can see, things just don't line up. Things are going wrong. What on earth is happening? Now you can look at the details of Egyptian history for around this particular time period, and again, sorry if you're getting a little bit bored about this, but we won't take too long over this. But we have Thutmose II, 1513 to 1499. His mummy was discovered. He'd scarcely reached the age of 30 when he became victim to a disease which was clearly visible even after the process of embalming took place. So he was not the pharaoh of the Exodus, clearly, because he was not drowned in the Red Sea. He died of a disease. He was also not the pharaoh before the Exodus. Now, many people forget that the pharaoh of the Exodus might have only reigned for a very short time, because the preceding pharaoh, the pharaoh of the oppression, if you might call him that, reigned for about at least 40 years. 40 years, then Moses fled into the wilderness fled into the back of beyond for 40 years until he came back when that pharaoh had died, and then the pharaoh of the Exodus was around for a short time before he drowned in the sea. So Thutmose II was obviously not the pharaoh of the oppression, because he had only reached the age of 30 when he was dead, so he had a short reign, nowhere near the 40-year reign that we need to find. We come to the next one, Thutmose III, and these dates, I should emphasize, are not precise. They're different chronologies, depending a little bit on how you interpret astronomical observations. Astronomical observations are great, but they didn't know where the observations were taking place, from which city, so there's a little bit of ambiguity. But this guy, Thutmose III, created the largest empire Egypt had ever seen. No fewer than 17 campaigns were conducted, and he conquered lands from Syria to Upper Nubia, and he constructed over 50 temples. So this doesn't sound like someone who's recovering from the aftermath of 10 devastating plagues. This sounds like someone who's quite prosperous. So how was he the pharaoh of the oppression? Well, his reign ends about 1450, which is 50 years after what we think the Exodus is. And when we get to the next pharaoh, Amenhotep II, again, more construction work, more military campaigns, another mummy. Again, no sign of any problems. So this is why we say things really don't fit. And you can try hard to make them fit if you want, but taking things at face value, as we try to do, the archaeologists do a brilliant job, I believe, of unearthing the history, and it's not up to us to try and change the facts such as they are. But wait, there's more. There's another problem. In Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, it says, "Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses." Now we don't know about Pithom, but we do know about Ramses, because that was actually the name of a pharaoh, a great pharaoh in Egyptian history. The city of Ramses, that's not the number 3.14, that's a prefix to say home of the pharaoh. Ramses was built by Ramses the Great around 1292, give or take. This is about 200 years after the presumed date for the Exodus. So this fits very badly. At this time, you'd say things are really not looking good at all. The city that they're building was in 1493. It was just vacant land, and then 200 years later, the city of Ramses is built. Don't worry too much about the spelling. I think different people spell it slightly differently. It's only the consonants that really matter. We come back to the Bible now. From the time from the Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple, there's a little wrinkle here, you might say. So we just heard there was 480 years, but if you look up Josephus, who was a Jewish historian living in the 1st century AD, he said it was 592, which is slightly different from 480. What's going on here? Are we saying Josephus is a more reliable reference? Not at all, but we do have to ask the question, why does he say this? He's probably just as familiar with 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. He may even have access to older documents that we don't have anymore. So why is he saying this? Why are the numbers so very different? At the very least, we have to ask the question, what's going on here? We really have to have a correct number if we want to work out the date for the Exodus. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 20, there's another thing that we need to consider. It says, "And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet." So this is saying that the time period of the judges was 450 years. There are some questions about the Greek of this particular verse, but I'm using the majority text here. But leave that aside for a moment. 450 years for the judges. We'll look at that again in a later slide. 450 years plus 40 years when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. Then there were 7 years when they were conquering the land in Canaan, subduing the land. And then there was an unknown time period where the elders in the land of Joshua's generation got old and died. Then there were 40 years of King Saul, and 40 years of King David, and then 4 years of King Solomon until he started building the temple. And so you come to a number that's bigger than 581 years in total. This does not match up with what we read in 1 Kings chapter 6. 580 is very different from 480, and it's much closer to the number that Josephus quotes. Just to check that 450 years for the time period of the Judges, you can read through the book of Judges. The book of Judges actually mentions a total of 430 years, and you can add them up yourselves, and after that a time period for Samuel, which you can actually work out as 20 years, but that's in 1 Samuel. It doesn't actually say that's how long his reign is, but it talks about the capture of the Ark of the Covenant, and then 20 years later the recovery of the Ark of the Covenant from the Philistines. So we get to a total of 450 years in Judges and Samuel, just as it says in the book of Acts. So we start to think, well, maybe this 450 years is right, and maybe Josephus knew what he was talking about. The 480 years, maybe excluding the 111 years of foreign rule. So the 480 years, and we're not saying 1 Kings 6 was wrong, just that it was referring to good years and was excluding the bad years, which didn't count. That's a speculation, of course, of how to interpret this conflict, but if we don't have that, how do we resolve this conflict? There are other small unknowns. There's 3 years when Abimelech was king over Israel. He was an Israelite. Do you count him as an oppressor, or do you count that as one of the bad years? So there's still a few more tiny uncertainties in there that throw things around a little bit. There's also a little bit of uncertainty. King David was still alive when King Solomon was crowned, so was that a 1 year overlap as well? So the tiny little details that you can fuss about if you really want to. I'm not too concerned about such things. But the end result, fanfare, sound of trumpets and applause, Exodus 1602 to 1606 BC, and the fall of Jericho 1562 to 1566 BC, and that time range is based on the possible ways of interpreting the scriptures. But these are the Bible numbers. This is not some numbers pulled out of our hat to try and make things fit. This is what the Bible says, I believe. And you tell that to any Bible chronologist, and they'll throw up their hands in horror and say, I don't believe it, I don't think that's right, because they just want to cling on to their own chronologies, but such is life. So now we should go on and compare with what these dates say about the comparison with Egyptian history. First of all, we should start off with Jericho. And in Joshua it says, then they burnt the whole city. Notice they burnt the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. On the 7th day it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of a trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, and they took the city, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city. So it's talking about complete, utter destruction of a city, burning the city. And archaeologists have studied the site of Jericho. Jericho is a very, very old city that's been around for many years, and they found many layers of cities built on successive layers. There is one layer called Jericho 4, and in Jericho 4 you do see a burn layer, a very thick burn layer, where they find where they can find the carbon, and they can carbon date it. So we got a biblical date for the fall of Jericho that we now think is 1562, carbon dating 1560 plus or minus 40 years. So we get to perfect agreement. The carbon dating, there's more to the story than that. There were older carbon dating that was less accurate and came to a different date, and this latter date has been unpopular with the Bible chronologists, so they don't like that very much, but it fits perfectly with what we believe is the biblical date for the fall of Jericho. I should mention that carbon dating especially this type of carbon dating, was done with accelerated mass spectrometry, which is much more accurate, much more precise, and much more reliable than previous carbon dating. So it is a number that you can rely on as much as you can rely on any fact that there is. It's not the only piece of information. You can analyze pottery and determine dates. I think they used something like resonance thermoluminescence and came to a date of around 1550. I don't think they have particular error bars for that, but that was again a very similar date for the analysis of pottery. And look, it matches perfectly with what we got for the fall of Jericho according to the Bible numbers. Now we need to look at what was happening in Egypt at around 1600 BC. Now they were ruled by what's known as the 15th dynasty, sometimes known as a Hyksos. Little is known about this period, and when we say little is known about this period, we can say, woohoo, we've eliminated all the conflict already. There's now no longer any problem between the Bible and Egyptian history. So problem solved, you can go home and relax. But we can look at this in a little bit more detail and extract the tiny shards of evidence that there is around. We can find the dates of particular kings from this 15th dynasty. There were actually a division. There'd been the Hyksos had conquered the lower Egypt, the Nile Delta region, but the native Egyptians still had a kingdom of their own in Upper Egypt, based in Thebes, and there was conflict between the two, and the conflict eventually ended with the native Egyptians expelling the Hyksos from Egypt altogether. And so the start of one Pharaoh called Khan, we'll call him Khan, I don't know how to pronounce his full name. He had something like a 30 or 40 year reign, not much is known, so we don't really know his exact reign, but we do get dates that seem to match very well with what we found. First year of Apophis or Apepi, he had a 40-year reign, and he was in continual conflict with the Egyptians, Kamos and Amos, who tried to drive him out of the land. And eventually they drove out Kamudi, his successor. I'm using here the Egyptian high chronology. Again, plus or minus 20, well, minus 20 years if you use the low chronology. So, when we look at dates in Egyptian history, we're not saying it's exact. We don't know dates like we do these days, but plus or minus 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we're quite content that those are very similar dates. Now in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8 it reads, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." So this is talking about a new king. They were no longer on good terms with the descendants of Joseph, and indeed the Israelites become slaves. And if you look at Egyptian history, after a very unsettled period known as the Second Intermediate Period, new rulers appear known as the Hyksos. And the Egyptian, I won't even try and pronounce that, but it translated foreign rulers. A long time ago that was mistranslated as shepherd kings, and that has caused problems ever since. You can correct an error, but the error just keeps on going and keeps on going. Just like misinformation spreads faster than corrections to misinformation. So these shepherd kings eventually in some circles become associated with the building of a great pyramid, even though the Great Pyramid was 1,000 years earlier. That's just the way some of these rumours start to spread. But the Hyksos, they're actually an ethnically mixed group of people from the land of Canaan. They were Canaanites who came into the eastern Nile Delta region either as an invasion or migration, and they initiated the Second Intermediate Period. It's worth mentioning that during this Second Intermediate Period there was something like 100 pharaohs in 100 years, so it was very unstable, and they rose to power and they ruled Lower and Middle Egypt for over 100 years. Josephus identified the expulsion of the Israelites, the Exodus, with the Hyksos. So he had this inkling that maybe these two things were connected in a way, but he sort of jumped to the conclusion that the Hyksos were the Israelites, which is not the case. And any time people discuss this, they say the Hyksos are not Israelites, and they're correct, they're Canaanites. But the fact that they're not Israelites doesn't mean that it's not related to the time of the Exodus. They were actually the oppressors of the Israelites. So they were the rulers at the time of the Exodus, and after the 10 plagues struck their land, their hold over the country was weakened, and their Egyptian enemies based in the south drove them out by force. So we see something similar, the expulsion of the Hyksos and the exodus of the Israelites at different time periods, and the differences between the two events. But you do see why there are similarities and why there was some degree of confusion over these things. And part of a comparison, we notice that the Hyksos were smaller in number than the Israelites, and this is one of the things that they were worried about in Exodus chapter 1 verse 9. And he said unto his people, that's the Pharaoh, he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them out of the land of Egypt. And these verses suddenly take on a whole new meaning when you understand that they did have enemies, that they were afraid that the enemies would fight against them, and they were afraid of the children of Israel being more and mightier than them because they were in smaller number. The number finally expelled from Egypt, I think, was about 300,000 Hyksos expelled from Egypt, and that's much less than the total number of Israelites at the time of the Exodus, which was around 600,000 men, plus women and children, so the Israelites eventually greatly outnumbered them. But these verses in Exodus 1 verse 9 and 10 were referring to a time before Moses was born, so it was 80 years before the Exodus. One interesting detail is that the Hyksos were actually the people who introduced the war chariot to Egypt. Before this time, chariots were used mainly as carriages. Your Uber driver or whoever, they were people who drove you around, but they eventually became a weapon of war. And this was thanks in part to the Hyksos. They brought many more technological advancements in warfare, and that may have been how they managed to overthrow the Egyptians in the Upper Nile region, in the Nile Delta region. Apologies. And we know that they had chariots in Exodus 14 verses 7 through to 9, And he made ready his chariot, as Pharaoh, and took his people with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with an high hand, but the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, and his horsemen, and his army. And we know what happened to them. The historical spread of the war chariot, people have made a stab at how it spread, but they think it originated in Central Asia and eventually spread through much of the world from there. Obviously, if it starts in Central Asia before it gets to Egypt, it has to go through Canaan. Another interesting thing in terms of comparing the Egyptian history with the Bible account, the children of Israel were located in the Nile Delta region, and it says the land of Goshen, which is the Nile Delta. And coming back to Exodus 1 verse 11, therefore did they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. The Hyksos capital was in the city of Avaris in the northeastern region of the Nile Delta. So that's in the northeastern region. And the city was eventually destroyed when the Hyksos were overthrown. But many centuries later, the land was left empty for a long time, but eventually a new city was built on the site or very near the site, and that was the city of Ramses. So here's a remarkable thing. We've got this city, Ramses. You can imagine that if you're writing the book of Exodus many years after the book of Exodus, that you refer to the local name of the city, not the name that was there hundreds of years earlier. No one would have known what Avaris was. They would have known what Ramses was. But so they describe it as Ramses, the new name of the city. And it's also worth mentioning that each Egyptian dynasty had its capital in a different city. There might have been some overlap, but different dynasties had different cities as their capital. They might have had capitals in Thebes or Memphis or Cairo or Alexandria or wherever, but the name Ramses points very clearly to a dynasty based in that region. So again, we're pointing ourselves at the Hyksos because they were the ones that were based in this location. It's worth mentioning that the Hyksos were not popular with the Egyptian people, obviously not popular with the Israelites, if they were people that unkind that they were willing to drown babies in the Nile River. The Greek writer Herodotus describes the Hyksos period by saying, "Thus they reckon that for 106 years Egypt was in great misery, and the temples so long shut were never opened. So much do the people hate the memory of those two kings that they do not greatly wish to name them, and they call the pyramids after the shepherd Philetus, who pastured his flocks in this place." So they absolutely hated these people. They didn't even want to mention their name. It's interesting that the Bible doesn't mention his name either. The Bible does sometimes mention the names of kings and pharaohs. It mentions Pharaoh Necho and Pharaoh Shishak, but doesn't mention the name of this pharaoh at all. So the pharaohs, the kings that we believe are probably Khan as the pharaoh of the oppression, and Apophis as the king picking up the pieces after the Exodus. Now, one of the reasons for the plagues was that the Lord was going to strike the gods of Egypt in Exodus 12, verse 12. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. So this is part of a point of the plagues, that Egypt was going to be struck, that all the gods of Egypt were going to be exposed as false gods, worthless things that were not worth the paint used to picture them. According to a New Kingdom story about the Hyksos area, and papyrus, etc., by translation, etc., by Edward F. Wendt, King Apophis adopted Seth also known as Sutek, for himself as Lord, and he refused to serve any other god that was in the entire land. So this fits in with Herodotus' claim that the temples in the land were closed. If Apophis was ruler dealing with the aftermath of the 10 plagues, this may have been the reason for closing the temples. All of the previous gods had been worthless. Maybe Seth was the god who was least afflicted by the plagues, and many of the plagues specifically targeted things associated with particular gods, and that's another story for another time. Now, one other thing worth mentioning, and this has been mentioned by many people before, this is not a new thing. There is a massive volcanic eruption about 3.5 millennia ago. This was at the site of Santorini. There was a volcanic eruption that was huge. The giant central lagoon measures around 12 kilometers by 7 kilometers, and the eruption ejected approximately 30 cubic kilometers of magma up to 36 kilometers high into the sky. And if you're doing tourist attractions, you can go and visit the site. It's supposed to be spectacular. So this was a massive eruption, dust thrown way up into the air. And recent dendrochronological, that's tree links, research, radiocarbon dating, and Greenland ice cores findings indicate that the eruption occurred between 1650 and 1600 BC. Now in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 21, talking about the 9th plague, and the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And so this could well have happened as a result of this massive volcanic eruption. A darkness that could be felt. You can just imagine the dust in the air. However, I do emphasize that we're not really looking for a natural explanation for what's really a supernatural event. But maybe this is how it took place, not why it took place, of course. Another thing that's interesting to note, that Pharaoh was named by Moses was named by Pharaoh's daughter in Exodus chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses, because she said, because I drew him out of the water. So this is essentially an Egyptian name. Moses was named by Pharaoh's daughter. So that's very interesting. But the interesting thing is that we see the name Moses appears in many of the names of subsequent pharaohs. There are pharaohs called Thutmose that we've already heard about, Ahmose and Kamose. Kamose was the last king of Theban 17th dynasty. His reign is important for his decisive military initiatives he took against the Hyksos. Ahmose I was the pharaoh of ancient Egypt and the founder of the 18th dynasty. During his reign he completed the conquest and expulsion of Hyksos, and then we get to Thutmose I, 2 and 3. And if Moses had been seen as a great leader and partly responsible for the overthrow of the Hyksos and defeat of the Hyksos and striking them with all these plagues, although it was the Lord that struck them, but if Moses had been seen as a great leader, that might be why they called their names, gave themselves names that included Moses in their name. It's a name that was just there in Egyptian history for a short time as a type of name that they used. Later on the names became very different, and earlier they were very different as well. So either it was because of Moses, or maybe it was just a popular name at the time, as trends go in names. There is one interesting thing worth mentioning. A stela set up in Avaris contains the nomen and prenomen of Khan and now lost dedication, presumably to Seth, Lord of Avaris, below which are inscribed the title and name of the eldest king's son, Yonasi. And the assertion of Khan with those of his eldest son upon the stela or monument suggests that the latter, in fact, was his designated successor, is also implied by his title. And the appearance instead as Apophis as successor has led to the speculation that Apophis was a usurper, but there are other possibilities. If Khan was the ruler oppressing the Israelites and causing Moses to flee to Midian, his son Yonasi may only have ruled long enough for Moses to return to Egypt and for the plagues to unfold. In that case, Yonasi's brief rule would have never made it to the annals of recorded history. So we see here one indication of someone who's appearing as a nominated successor, but doesn't appear apart from that in history books. And it's worth noting this guy was a firstborn son, and part of the 10th plague was the death of all the firstborn sons. I don't know if that actually included Pharaoh himself, but Pharaoh himself did actually die in the Red Sea. And in Exodus 12:12, Pharaoh passed through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. So now we come to the conclusions for the time of the Exodus. How well does the Bible fit with the known history, the history without adjusting things, without changing numbers or reinterpreting facts? How well does the Bible fit? The biblical date for the fall of Jericho matches carbon dating exactly. The pattern of a pharaoh reigning for 40 years, followed by a brief reign, followed by a pharaoh facing major difficulties, is seen exactly with the pharaohs that we've mentioned. The location of Hyksos, capital of Avaris, matches the location of the city of Ramses, mentioned in Exodus in the Nile Delta. The name Moses matches the names of subsequent pharaohs, Kamose, Ahmose, Thutmose. The Hyksos were smaller in number than the Israelites and were threatened by their enemies in the south. And the Hyksos introduced the war chariot to Egypt. And volcanic eruptions could easily have been responsible for a darkness that could be felt. So we see overall there is a remarkably close match. It's not just a case of no conflict, it actually fits in perfectly and beautifully how all the things that are there, even though we're just getting little fragments of information, temples being shut, things like the successor disappearing from history, the war chariot, everything, it's all there, and remarkable and exciting. Now, at this point you might want to end, or you might want to go on, if you can endure a little bit more. We can now look at Egypt, a bit more about Egyptian history and Joseph in the land of Egypt. This won't take long. Now, if taking our Bible chronologies, we're now seeing that Joseph was taken captive to Egypt around 1839 BC and appeared to be Pharaoh about 1827 BC. Not that exact numbers mean much. If we'd used our old chronology, the one that so many people are fond of, it would have put Joseph in the second intermediate period, trying to survive with pharaohs with reign for 1 year at the most, and a very unstable period. But now Joseph is there in the Middle Kingdom during the 12th dynasty, a very good time to be around. Egypt was prosperous, things were successful. The actual Pharaoh that was possibly the Pharaoh that Joseph saw was almost certainly Amenemhat III. Estimated dates for his reign vary slightly, but it's quite a long reign, so it's quite easy to fit within that. And so the picture that you see on the screen may well be the picture that Joseph saw. Interesting little fact there. This Pharaoh was clean shaven, and Joseph, when he went to appear before Pharaoh, he shaved. Just a minor little detail, I don't know if it's significant, but there it is. Joseph had to shave before he appeared before Pharaoh. As we know the story, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams of 7 fat cattle followed by 7 thin ones, representing 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Genesis 41, this is the thing which I've spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he shows unto Pharaoh, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And so a prediction of 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Now I picked up an interesting book. I just wanted a reliable and reputable book from an independent source. So I picked up the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, editor Ian Shaw, and in this book it has a passage where it says the annual Nile inundation was critical for Egypt food supply. That means good Nile flooding means good food. Low levels of Nile means drought. Amenemhat's records reveal extremely high levels for part of his reign, the highest being in year 30 when it reached 5.1 meters, but these subsequently tapered away sharply, so that in year 40 the level was only 0.5 meters. Such fluctuations must have had a devastating or destabilizing effect on the economy. So we're not told about year by year how high the level was, but we do have two data points 10 years apart, one very, very high, one very, very low, and using the dates, there is actually an astronomical observation that helps to try and get a reasonable date for these things. So based on that, we find that the high Nile flood would have occurred in 1850 BC with a low 1820. Again, plus or minus, we're not sure exactly how much. Within a decade or two, we'd be quite happy if it's correct to that level. The time estimates based on Bible chronology for the 7 years of plenty, 1825 to 1819, and 1818 to 1812 for the 7 years of famine. So this actually fits in very, very, very well. We know it's during this Pharaoh's reign, and we know that there was a record high, and we know that there was a record low, and the timing is within a few years of an exact match, which is absolutely brilliant. One further thing to note, and here we're not getting into the same level of precision as before, but just giving a general overview of a picture of what things were like. Pharaoh became very rich, and you can read all about that in Genesis 47, and I'll go through some of these verses, but you can read more yourself. In verse 13 of Genesis 47, there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of a famine. That was in the beginning of a famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they brought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So Joseph collected a lot of money for the food and saved it up for Pharaoh, who was obviously going to be very, very pleased with his increased wealth. And in verse 15, and when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth. And Joseph said, Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money faileth. So now Joseph is collecting cattle because there's no more money to pay them with. And then in verse 20, and Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. So Pharaoh would have been immensely wealthy, beyond imagination, probably beyond anything we can comprehend in our time. Now, there's an interesting about Amenemhat III, that we do know a little bit about some of his construction work. We don't have detailed pictures. Sorry for the quality of this picture, but an artist's impression barely captures the scope of his work. This is what's known as the Labyrinth of Amenemhat III, described by Greek historian Herodotus as more impressive than the Great Pyramid. So he had built this huge building, not a maze. It wasn't that kind of labyrinth. It was so intricate. 3,000 rooms and courtyards and galleries, and well decorated and decked with marble and all statues and all the rest, and connected by an underground tunnel to this pyramid, which was half the size of a great pyramid. So this is an immense construction that Amenemhat III made. So he must have been an incredibly wealthy pharaoh to be able to do this. And amazing coincidence that this is exactly the pharaoh who is so wealthy due to the 7 years of famine and Joseph carefully collecting money for him. This, incidentally, this immense structure was built on the side of a lake, an artificial lake, a huge lake built. Essentially, we're talking about an artificial lake built in the middle of a Sahara desert. It was huge and surrounded by massive irrigation, and we'll come to that in a second. But first, coming back to the labyrinth, the Greek historian Herodotus, about 450 BC, they caused to be made a labyrinth situated a little above the lake of Moeris, and nearly opposite to that which is called the City of Crocodiles. This I saw myself, and I found it greater than words can say. For if one should put together and reckon up all the buildings and all the great works produced by Hellenes, that's the Greeks, they would prove to be inferior in labour and expense to this labyrinth, though it is true that both the Temple of Ephesus and that at Samos are works worthy of note. The pyramids also were greater than words can say, and each one of them is equal to many works of the Hellenes, great as they may be, but the labyrinth surpasses even the pyramids. So this construction of Amenemhat III was greater than all the work that the Greeks had done, including the temple at Ephesus, which was the Temple of Diana, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's greater than all of the Greek works, including that one, greater also than the Great Pyramid, and that was his impression. Unfortunately, nothing remains of these structures today. In Genesis 41, verse 41, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his land and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. So Joseph became ruler, obviously second to Pharaoh. There was actually a position called vizier, the title of vizier, which means second in command of the land of Egypt. We don't know much about Amenemhat's vizier. There is a reference. The only vizier who can be specifically dated to the time of Amenemhat III went by the Egyptian name of Keti, who is referred to in a papyrus fragment dated to the 29th year of a king. In the installation of a vizier, a text referring to the office of a vizier found in several New Kingdom tombs, that's much later on. There's a mention of a famous vizier named Keti. About him and said, he impoverished his associates for the benefits of others. And that can be found in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. Although it's unlikely you can find any of these things, most of scientific documents are hidden behind paywalls, so you have to pay to see them. So much for freedom of information, but that's another story. And here we come to a little bit of speculation. We've been talking about facts so far, but now a little bit of speculation, a very interesting piece of speculation. Joseph lived in Egypt for many years, and we know in Genesis 50 verse 22, Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. So he was 110 when he died. He was 30 when he appeared before Pharaoh. So there's another 80 years of his life in Egypt, and you wonder, what did he do all that time? Now, in his book A Test of Time, David Roll, sorry I've mispronounced your name, David, he suggests that a waterway called Bar Yusuf was the work of Joseph when he was vizier for King Amenemhat III. The name Bar Yusuf translates from Arabic as the Waterway of Joseph. This waterway was a canal 15 kilometers long and 5 meters deep that channeled water from a branch of the Nile. It was part of an immense hydrological scheme undertaken during the 12th dynasty, using natural features of the landscape to fill a huge hollow to create Lake Moeris. It also irrigated a region in excess of 1,000 square kilometers, forming what became a very fertile and productive land. Dams at either end were also used to regulate the flow of water and to reduce the effects of excessive flooding from the Nile. So this is an immense waterway that the Egyptians created. That's not speculation, that's a fact. The 12th dynasty pharaohs created this waterway. They created this immense lake that Amenemhat built his palace in front of, also with great statues in front of, by the way, and a region with massive irrigation scheme, 1,000 square kilometers. It's hard to imagine the size, all the kinds of things that they would have grown there, it's beyond imagining just what they could have done with so much irrigation in such a fertile region. And so, but on top of that, they had dams at either end to regulate the flow of water, and that means that if it was a massively high flooding of the Nile, they could reduce the impact of that further downstream by siphoning off some of the water. So this is a very impressive hydrological scheme that they conducted. Very interesting. But I guess the speculation that the name is that the Bar Yusuf, the waterway of Joseph, that this was the waterway that Joseph worked on, and that his name is linked to this. In this picture, a modern-day map, the lake has since dried up to a large extent, but you can still see in the center of a map there is the lake where Lake Moeris was. It's now very green, fertile land close to the land of around the River Nile, which is again another green area. A slight close-up gives you a little bit more picture that there's this very narrow waterway that used to direct the water into the lake. I think this is a quote from Wikipedia. The Bar Yusuf, which roughly translates from Arabic as the waterway of Joseph, is a canal which connects the River Nile with the Fayum in Egypt. This was originally in prehistoric times a natural offshoot of the Nile, which created a lake to the west during high floods. Beginning with the 12th dynasty, the waterway was enlarged and the Fayum region was developed to enlarge Lake Moeris. The canal was built into the natural incline of a valley, creating a channel 15 kilometers long and 5 meters deep that sloped into the Fayum depression. The canal was controlled by the dam, which was actually two dams that regulated the flow into the lake and out of the Nile. As the surrounding area changed at about 230 BC, the Bar Yusuf eventually became neglected, leaving most of the Lake Moeris to dry up, creating the depression that exists today in the modern province of El Fayum. So the province is still there, but either mismanagement by when the Greeks controlled Egypt around 200 BC, or maybe the changes in the flow of the River Nile and its tributaries, the canal started to dry up. It's still an absolutely remarkable thing, the waterway of Joseph. But we can look at the general features of how well Joseph in Egypt fits with the general features of the 12th dynasty rulers of Egypt at this time. The pharaohs had a close interest in agriculture, which may not seem like much, but many great rulers, their interest in conquest and glory, getting concerned with agriculture is not really most people's thing, but this was a notable thing about the rulers at this time. I have a quote somewhere from Encyclopedia Britannica about that, but we don't have time to go into all of that. They had generally the rulers at this time reigned for a long time, just like Joseph's Pharaoh must have. He must have ruled at least 14 years because of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, plus 2 years from when Joseph was in Egypt, when Joseph was in prison with the butler and the baker. So pharaohs had a long reign, and that coincides quite well with what we see. It wasn't always the case. In the second intermediate period, the pharaohs had a very short reign, on average. History says there were no major military conflicts, which would have given rise to a very peaceful and productive time, which generally fits in quite well. There was a hierarchical central government, which means Pharaoh was the boss, everyone obeyed him. You might think that's fairly normal, but previous dynasties had a feudal system where there were regional rulers, and the Pharaoh didn't actually have that much control. But the time when Joseph was around, Pharaoh was obviously the top dog, and that coincides with what it was like during the 12th dynasty. Foreign people were actually encouraged to migrate to Egypt. Partly they were encouraged to help with the construction work and also for mining work in the Sinai region. So immigration was encouraged, just like Joseph's family was allowed to migrate to Egypt, and that wasn't always the case in later centuries. They didn't encourage migration, particularly after their experience with Hyksos. They indeed tried to stop migration from other places. So, just a quote from the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. Ironically, the large intake of Asiatics, that means from Canaan and beyond, which seems to have occurred partly in order to subsidize the extensive building work, may have encouraged the so-called Hyksos to settle in the delta, thus leading eventually to the eventual collapse of a native Egyptian rule. So that's the story, and we see here something that's amazing, the comparison between what the Bible says and what's in Egyptian history. When you use the correct timeline, it fits perfectly. When you use the wrong timeline, it clashes very badly. Even though people don't want to admit that it clashes badly, it really does. When you use the correct timeline, it's perfect, and we can say that it looks very good. So I'll leave that there. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and again, congratulations for getting through all of this.